Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am MK Jabin Taj. Today in this video I am giving you the knowledge about the fourth module of the subject Unix programming for 5th sem CSC CBCS VTU students. I am dedicating this video to all the students all over the world. Now let us see module 4, changing user IDs and group IDs. When our programs need additional privileges or need to gain access to resources that they currently are not allowed to access, they need to change their user or group ID to an ID that has the appropriate privilege or access. Similarly, when our programs need to lower their privileges or prevent access to certain resources, they do so by changing either their user ID or group ID to an ID without the privilege or ability access to the resource. See the syntax here. Both written 0 if OK, 1 on error. There are rules for who can change the IDs. Let's consider only the user ID for now. Everything we describe for the user ID also applies to the group ID. If the process has super user privileges, the set UID function sets the real user ID, effective user ID and saved set user ID to UID. If the process does not have super user privileges but UID equals either the real user ID or the saved set user ID, set UID sets only the effective user ID to UID. The real user ID and the saved set user ID are not changed. If neither of these two conditions is true, erroneous set to EPERM and 1 is returned. We can make a few statements about the user IDs that the kernel maintains. Only a super user process can change the real user ID. Normally, the real user ID is set by the login of one program. When we log in and never changes because login is a super user process, it sets all 3 user IDs when it calls set UID. The effective user ID is set by the exec functions only if the set user ID bit is set for the program file. If the set user ID bit is not set, the exec functions leave the effective user ID as its current value. We can call set UID at any time to set the effective user ID to either the real user ID or the saved set user ID. Naturally, we cannot set the effective user ID to any random value. The saved set user ID is copied from the effective user ID by exec. If the file's set user ID bit is set, this copy is saved after exec stores the effective user ID from the file's user ID. See the table here. The above figure summarizes the various ways these 3 user IDs can be changed. Set re UID and set re GID functions. Swapping of the real user ID and the effective user ID with the set re UID function. See the syntax here. Both returns 0 if OK, -1 on error. We can supply a value of 1 for any of the arguments to indicate that the corresponding ID should remain unchanged. The role is simple. An unprivileged user can always swap between the real user ID and the effective user ID. This allows a set user ID program to swap the user's normal permissions and swap back again later for set user ID operations. Set EUID and set EGID functions. POSIX.1 includes the two functions set EUID and set EGID. These functions are similar to set UID and set GID, but only the effective user ID or effective group ID is changed. See the syntax here, both return 0 if OK, 1 on error. And unprivileged user can set its effective user ID to either its real user ID or its saved set user ID. For a privileged user, only the effective user ID is set to UID. This differs from the set UID function, which changes all three user IDs. See the figure here. Figure shows summary of all the functions that set the various user IDs. Interpreter files. These files are text files that begin with a line of the form. See the syntax here. The space between the exclamation point and the path name is optional. The most common of these interpreter files begin with the line. See here. The path name is normally an absolute path name since no special operations are performed on it, that is, the path is not used. The recognition of these files is done within the kernel as a part of processing the exec system call. The actual file that gets executed by the kernel is not the interpreter file, but the file specified by the path name on the first line of the interpreter file. Be sure to differentiate between the interpreter file, a text file that begins with exclamation, and the interpreter which is specified by the path name on the first line of the interpreter file. Be aware that systems place a size limit on the first line of an interpreter file. This limit includes the exclamation, the path name, the optional argument, the terminating new line, and any spaces. A program that executes an interpreter file is as shown below with the output. See here. Now let us see system function. See the syntax here. If command string is a null pointer, system returns non-zero only if a command processor is available. This feature determines whether the system function is supported on a given operating system under the Unix system. System is always available. Because the system is implemented by calling fork exec and wait PID, there are three types of return values. If either the fork fails or wait PID returns an error other than EINTER, system returns 1 with error set to indicate the error. If the exec fails, implying that the shell cannot be executed, the return value is as if the shell had executed. Exit of 127. Otherwise, all three functions fork, exec, and wait PID succeed, and the return value from system is the termination status of the shell in the format specified for wait PID. See the program here, the system function without signal handling. Now let us see the program for calling the system function. See here the program continues, and the program for execute the command line arguments using a system is there, and the program to print real and effective user IDs is there. See here. Process accounting. Most Unix systems provide an option to do process accounting. When enabled, the kernel writes an accounting record each time a process terminates. These accounting records are typically a small amount of binary data with the name of the command, the amount of CPU time used, and the user ID and group ID, the starting time, and so on. A super user executes action with a path name argument to enable accounting. The accounting records are written to the specified file, which is usually /var/account/acct. Accounting is turned off by executing action without any arguments. The data required for accounting record, such as CPU times and number of characters transferred, is kept by the kernel in the process table and initialized whenever a new process is created, as in the child after a fork. Each accounting record is written when the process terminates. This means that the order of the records in the accounting file corresponds to the termination order of the processes, not the order in which they were started. The accounting records correspond to processes, not programs. A new record is initialized by the kernel for the child after a fork, not when a new program is executed. The structure of accounting records is defined in the header /acct .h and looks something like as follows. See here the values for account flag from accounting record. Program to generate accounting data. See here. Here the programs continues and the process structure for accounting example is there. Diagrammatical presentation. See here. User identification. Any process can find out its real and effective user ID and group ID. Sometimes, however, we want to find out the login name of the user who is running the program. We could call get PWUID, get UID. But what if a single user has multiple login names, each with the same user ID? A person might have multiple entries in the password file with the same user ID to have a different login shell for each entry. The system normally keeps track of the name we log in, and the get login function provides a way to fetch that login name. See the syntax here. Returns pointer to string giving login name if OK, null on error. This function can fail if the process is not attached to a terminal that a user logged in to. Now let us see the process times. We describe 3 times that we can measure: wall clock time, user CPU time, and system CPU time. Any process can call the times function to obtain these values for itself and any terminated children. See the syntax here. Returns elapsed wall clock time in clock ticks if OK, 1 on error. This function fills in the TMS structure pointed to by buff. See the syntax here. Note that the structure does not contain any measurement for the wall clock time. Instead, the function returns the wall clock time as the value of the function. Each time it's called, this value is measured from some arbitrary point in the past, so we can't use its absolute value. Instead, we use its relative value. Now let us see process relationships. Introduction. In this chapter, we will look at process groups in more detail and the concept of sessions that was introduced by the POSIX.1. We also look at the relationship between the login shell that is invoked for us when we log in and all the processes that we start from our login shell. Now let us see terminal logins. The terminals were either local directly connected or remote connected through a modem. In either case, these logins came through a terminal device driver in the kernel. The system administrator creates a file, usually /etc/ttys, that has one line per terminal device. Each line specifies the name of the device and other parameters that are passed to the Getty program. One parameter is the baud rate of the terminal. For example, when the system is bootstrapped, the kernel creates process ID 1, the init process, and it is init that brings the system up multi-user. The init process reads the file /etc/ttys, and for every terminal device that allows a login, does a fork followed by an exec of the program Getty. This gives us the process shown in the figure 9.1. See the figure here. All the processes shown in figure 9.1 have a real user ID of 0 and an effective user ID of 0, that is, they all have super user privileges. The init process also executes the Jetty program with an empty environment. It is Jetty that calls open for the terminal device. The terminal is opened for reading and writing. If the device is a modem, the open may delay inside the device driver until the modem is dialed and the call is answered. Once the device is open, file descriptors 0, 1, and 2 are set to the device. Then Jetty outputs something like login colon and waits for us to enter our username. When we enter our username, Jetty's job is complete and it then invokes the login program similar to exec le. See the syntax here. See the figure, a state of processes after login has been invoked. All the processes shown in the figure 9.2 have super user privileges since the original init process has super user privileges. If we log in correctly, login will change to our home directory, change the ownership of our terminal device, so we own it, change the access permissions for our terminal device, so we have permission to read from and write to it, set our group IDs by calling set gid and init groups, initialize the environment with all the information that login has, our home directory, shell, username and a default path. Change to our user ID, set UID and invoke our login shell as in. See the syntax here. The minus sign as the first character of argue V of 0 is a flag to all the shells that they are being invoked as a login shell. The shell can look at this character and modify their startup accordingly. See the figure 9.3, arrangement of processes after everything is set for a terminal login. Now let us see network logins. The main physical difference between logging into a system through a serial terminal and logging into a system through a network is that the connection between the terminal and the computer is not point to point with the terminal logins that we described in the previous section. Init knows with which terminal device are enabled for logins and spawns a Jetty process for each device. In the case of network logins, however, all the logins come through the kernel's network interface drivers. Let's assume that a TCP connection request arrives for the Telnet server. Telnet is a remote login application that uses the TCP protocol. A user on another host that is connected to the server's host through a network of some form or on the same host initiates the login by starting the Telnet client, Telnet host name. The client opens a TCP connection to host name and the program that's started on host name is called the Telnet server. The client and the server then exchange data across the TCP connection using the Telnet application protocol. What has happened is that the user who started the client program is now logged into the server's host. This assumes, of course, that the user has a valid account on the server's host. See the figure 9.4 shows the sequence of process involved in executing the Telnet server called Telnet D. See the figure here. The Telnet process then opens a pseudo terminal device and splits into two processes using fork. The parent handles the communication across the network connection and the child does an exec of the login program. The parent and the child are connected through the pseudo terminal. Before doing the exec, the child set up file descriptors 0, 1, and 2 to the sudo terminal. If we log in correctly, login performs the same step we described in the section 9.2. It changes to our home directory and sets our group IDs, user ID and our initial environment. Then login replaces itself with our login shell by calling exec. Figure 9.5 shows the arrangement of the process at this point. See the figure here. Now let us see process groups. A process group is a collection of one or more processes usually associated with the same job that can receive signals from the same terminal. Each process group has a unique process group ID. Process group IDs are similar to process IDs. They are positive integers and can be stored in PID data type. The function get pgrip returns the process group ID of the calling process. See the syntax here. Returns a process group ID of calling process. The single Unix specification defines the get pgid function as an XSI extension that mimics this behavior. See the syntax here. Returns process group ID if OK, one on error. Each process group can have a process group leader. The leader is identified by its process group ID being equal to its process ID. It is possible for a process group leader to create a process group, create processes in the group and then terminate the process group. Still exists as long as at least one process is in the group, regardless of whether the group leader terminates. This is called the process group lifetime, the period of the time that begins when the group is created and ends when the last remaining process leaves the group. The last remaining process in the process group can either terminate or enter some other process group. A process joins an existing process group or creates a new process group by calling set pgid. See the syntax here. Returns 0 if OK, 1 on error. This function sets the process group ID to pgid in the process whose process ID equals to PID. If the two arguments are equal, the process specified by PID becomes a process group leader. If PID is 0, the process ID of the caller is used. Now let us see sessions. A session is a collection of one or more process groups. For example, we could have the arrangement shown in the figure 9.6. Here we have the 3 process groups in a single session. See the figure here. A process establishes a new session by calling the set SID function. See the syntax here. Returns a process group ID is if OK, 1 on error. If the calling process is not a process group leader, this function creates a new session. 3 things happen. The process becomes the session leader of this new session. A session leader is the process that creates a session. The process is the only process in this new session. The process becomes the process group leader of a new process group. The new process group ID is the process ID of the calling process. The process has to controlling terminal. If the process had a controlling terminal before calling set SID, that association is broken. This function returns an error if the caller is already a process group leader. The get SID function returns the process group ID of a process session leader. The get SID function is included as an XSI extension in the single Unix specification. See the syntax here. Returns session leader's process group ID if OK, 1 on error. If PID is 0, gets ID returns the group process group ID of the calling process's session leader. Now let us see controlling terminal. Sessions and process group have a few other characteristics. A session can have a single controlling terminal. This is usually the terminal device in the case of a terminal login, or pseudo terminal device in the case of network login on which we log in. The session leader that establishes the connection to the controlling terminal is called controlling process. The process groups within a session can be divided into single foreground process group and one or more background process groups. If a session has a controlling terminal, it has a single foreground process group and all other process groups in the session are background process groups. Whenever we type the terminal's interrupt key, often delete or control C, this causes the interrupt signal be set to all processes in the foreground process group. Whenever we type the terminal's quit key, often control backslash, this causes the quit signal to be sent to all processes in the foreground process group. If a modem or network disconnect is detected by the terminal interface, the hang-up signal is sent to the controlling process, the session leader. These characteristics are shown in the figure 9.7. See the figure here. Now let us see TZ get PGRP, TC set PGRP and TC get SID functions. We need a way to tell the kernel which process group is the foreground process group so that the terminal device driver knows where to send the terminal input and the terminal generated signals. To retrieve the foreground process group ID and to set the foreground process group ID, we can use TCGETPRGP and TC set PGRP function. The prototype of these functions are as follows. See here syntax. Returns a process ID of foreground process group if OK -1 on error. See another syntax. Returns 0 if OK -1 on error. The function TC get PGRP returns the process group ID of the foreground process group associated with the terminal open on file des. If the process has a controlling terminal, the process can call TC set PGRP to set the foreground process group ID to PGRPID. The value of the PGRPID must be the process group ID of a process group in the same session, and file des must refer to the controlling terminal of the session. The single Unix specification defines an XSI extension called TCGETSID to allow an application to obtain the process group ID for the session leader given a file descriptor for the controlling terminal. See the syntax here. Returns session leader's process group ID if OK -1 on error. Now let us see job control. This feature allows us to start multiple jobs groups of processes from a single terminal and to control which job can access the terminal and which job are to run in the background. Job control requires three forms of the support. A shell that supports job control. The terminal driver in the kernel must support job control. The kernel must support certain job control signals. The interaction with the terminal driver arises because a special terminal character affects the foreground job. The suspend key typically controls Z. Entering this character causes the terminal driver to send the SIG TSTP signal to all processes in the foreground process group. The jobs in any background process groups are not affected. The terminal driver looks for three special characters which generate signals to the foreground process group. The interrupt character typically delete or control C generates sig int. The quit character typically control backslash generates sig quit. The suspend character typically control Z generates sig tstp. This signal normally stops the background job. By using the shell, we are notified of this and can bring the job into the foreground so that it can read from the terminal. The following demonstrates this. See the here. And the figure 9.8 summary of the job control features with foreground and background jobs and terminal driver. What happens if a background job outputs to the controlling terminal? This is an option that we can allow or disallow. Normally we use the stty of n stty of 1 command to change this option. The following shows how this works. See here. When we disallow background jobs from writing to the controlling terminal, cat will block when it tries to write to its standard output because the terminal driver identifies the write as coming from a background process and sends the job the sig ttou signal. See the figure 9.8 summarizes some of the features of job control that we have been describing. The solid lines through the terminal driver box mean that the terminal input, output and the terminal generated signals are always connected from the foreground process group to the actual terminal. The dashed line corresponding to the sig ttou signal means that whether the output from a process in the background process group appears on the terminal is an option. See here example shell execution of programs. Example 1, example 2 and example 3. See here output of example 3. This program cat1 is just a copy of the standard cat program with a different name. Note that the last process in the pipeline is the child of the shell and that the first process in the pipeline is a child of the last process. See the example 4 and the figure 9.9 processes in the pipeline PS cat1 cat2 when invoked by Bourne shell. Now let us see orphaned process groups. A process whose parents terminates is called an orphan and is inherited by the init process. See the program for creating a orphaned process group. See here program continues with output. The child inherits the process group of its parent 6099 after the fork. The parent sleeps for 5 seconds. This is our imperfect way of letting the child execute before the parent terminates. The child establishes a signal handle for the hang up signal. This is so we can see whether sig up is sent to the child. The child sends itself the stop signal with the kill function. This stops the child similar to our stopping a foreground job with our terminal's suspend character control Z. When the parent terminates, the child is orphaned, so the child's parent process ID becomes 1, the init process ID. At this point, the child is now a member of an orphaned process group. If the process group is not orphaned, then there is a chance that one of those parents in a different process group but in the same session will restart a stopped process in the process group that is not orphaned. Here the parent of every process in the group belongs to the another session. Since the process group is orphaned when the parent terminates, POSIX 6.1 requires that every process in the newly orphaned process group that is stopped as our child is be sent the hang up signal followed by the continue signal. This causes the child to be continued after processing the hang-up signal. The default action for the hang-up signal is to terminate the process, so we have to provide a single signal handler to catch the signal. We therefore expect the print pin the sig hub function to appear before the print pin the PRID's function. Now let us see overview of IPC methods. Introduction. IPC enables one application to control another application and for several applications to share the same data without interfering with one another. IPC is required in all multiprocessing systems, but it is not generally supported by single process operating systems. The various forms of IPC that are supported on a Unix system are as follows: half duplex pipes, FIFOs, full duplex pipes, named full duplex pipes, message queues, shared memory, semaphores, sockets, streams. The first 7 forms of IPC are usually restricted to IPC between processes on the same host. The final 2, that is socket and the streams, are the only 2 that are generally supported for IPC between processes on different hosts. Pipes are the oldest form of Unix system. IPC pipes have 2 limitations. Historically, they have been half duplex pipes can be used only between processes that have a common ancestor. Normally, a pipe is created by a process that process calls fork, and the pipe is used between the parent and the child. A pipe is created by calling the pipe function. See the syntax here. Returns 0 if OK, 1 on error. Two file descriptors are returned through the fields arguments. Field argument. Files of 0 is open for reading and files of 1 is open for writing. The output of files 1 is the input for files 0. 2 ways to picture a half duplex pipe are as shown in the figure 15.2. The left half of the figure shows the 2 ends of the pipe connected in a single process. The right half of the figure emphasizes that the data in the pipe flows through the kernel. A pipe in a single process is next to the useless. Normally, the process that calls a pipe then calls a fork, creating an IPC channel from the parent to the child or vice versa. See the figure 15.3 shows this scenario. What happens after the fork depends on which direction of the data flow we want. For a pipe from the parent to the child, the parent closes the read end of the pipe FDF0 and the child closes the write end FDF1. Figure 15.4 shows the resulting arrangement of descriptors. For a pipe from the child to the parent closes FDF1 and the child closes FDF0. When one end of the pipe is closed, the following 2 rules apply. If we read from a pipe whose right end has been closed, read returns 0 to indicate an end of the file after all the data has been read. If we write to a pipe whose read end has been closed, the signal sig pipe is generated. If we either ignore the signal or catch it and return from the signal handler, write returns 1 with error set to epipe. The following program shows the code to create a pipe between a parent and its child and to send data down the pipe. See the program. See here continuation of the program. Now let us see p open and p close functions. Since a common operation is to create a pipe to another process to either read its output or send send it input. The standard input output library has historically provided the p open and p close functions. These two functions handle all the dirty work that we have been doing ourselves, creating a pipe, forking a child, closing the unused ends of the pipe, executing a shell to run the command, and waiting for command to terminate. See the syntax here. First syntax returns file pointer if OK, null on error. Second syntax, see here, returns termination status of command string or 1 on error. The function p open does a fork and exec to execute the command string and returns a standard input output file pointer if type is R. The file pointer is connected to the standard output of command string. See the figure here. If type is W, the file pointer is connected to the standard input of the command string as shown in the following figure. Now let us see CO processes. A Unix system filter is a program that reads from standard input and writes to standard output. Filters are normally connected linearly in shell pipelines. A filter becomes a coprocess when the same program generates the filter's input and reads the filter's output. A coprocess normally runs in the background from a shell, and its standard input and standard output are connected to another program using a pipe. The process creates two pipes. One is the standard input of the coprocess and the other is the standard output of the coprocess. See the figure 15.16 shows this arrangement. See the program simple filter to add two numbers. Now let us see FIFO. FIFOs are sometimes called named pipes. Pipes can be used only between related processes when a common ancestor has created the pipe. See the syntax here. Return 0 if OK, 1 on error. Once we have used mkFIFO to create a FIFO, we open it using open. When we open a FIFO, the non-blocking flag O non-block affects what happens. In the normal case, and open for read only blocks until some other process opens the FIFO for writing. Similarly, and open for write only blocks until some other process opens the FIFO for reading. If O non-block is specified, an open for read only returns immediately, but an open for write only returns 1 with error set to NXIO if no process has the FIFO open for reading. There are two uses for FIFOs. FIFOs are used by shell commands to pass data from one shell pipeline to another without creating intermediate temporary files. FIFOs are used as rendezvous point in the client server application to pass data between the clients and the servers. Example, using FIFO to duplicate output streams. FIFOs can be used to duplicate an output stream in a series of shell commands. This prevents writing the data to an intermediate disk file. Consider a procedure that needs to process a filtered input stream twice. See the figure 15.20 shows this arrangement. With a FIFO and the Unix program T of 1, we can accomplish this procedure without using a temporary file. The T program copies its standard input to both its standard output and to the file named on its command line. We create the FIFO and then start program 3 in the background reading from the FIFO. We then start program 1 and use T2 send its input to both the FIFO and program 2. Figure 15.21 shows the process arrangement. See the figure here. Now let us see example client server communication using a FIFO. FIFOs can be used to send data between a client and server. If we have a server that is contacted by numerous clients, each client can write its request to a well-known FIFO that the server creates. Since there are multiple writers for the FIFO, the request sent by the clients to the server need to be less than pipe buff bytes in size. This prevents any interleaving of the client writes. The problem in using FIFOs for this type of client-server communication is how to send replace back from the server to each client. A single FIFO cannot be used as the client would never know when to read their response versus responses for other clients. One solution is for each client to send its process ID with the request. The server then creates a unique FIFO for each client using a path name based on the client's process ID. For example, the server can create a FIFO with name /btu/serve dot 5 times x, where 5 times x is replaced with the client's process ID. This arrangement works, although it is impossible for the server to tell whether a client crashes. This causes the client specific FIFO to be left in the file system. The server also must catch SIG pipe, since it's possible for a client to send a request and terminate before reading the response, leaving the client specific FIFO with one writer, the server, and no reader. See the figure here, client sending a request to a server using a FIFO. See the figure here, client server communication using FIFOs. Now let us see XSI IPC, identifiers and keys. Each IPC structure, message queue, semaphore and shared memory segment in the kernel is referred to by a non-negative integer identifier. The identifier is an internal name for an IPC object. Cooperating processes need an external naming scheme to be able to rendezvous using the same IPC object. For this purpose, an IPC object is associated with a key that acts as an external name. Whenever an IPC structure is being created, a key must be specified. The data type of this key is the primitive system data type key T, which is often defined as a long integer in the header sys/types.h. This key is converted into an identifier by the kernel. There are various ways for a client and the server to rendezvous at the same IPC structure. The server can create a new IPC structure by specifying a key of IPC private and store the return identifier somewhere, such as file. For the client to obtain the key IPC private guarantees that the server creates a new IPC structure. The disadvantage to this technique is that the file system operations are required for a server to write the integer identifier to a file and then for the client to retrieve this identifier later. The IPC private key is also used in the parent-child relationship. The parent creates a new IPC structure specifying IPC private and resulting identifier is then available to the child. After the fork, the child can pass the identifier to a new program as an argument to one of the exec functions. The client and the server can agree on a key by defining the key in a common header. For example, the server then creates a new IPC structure specifying this key. The problem with this approach is that it's possible for the key to already be associated with an IPC structure, in which case the get function returns an error, the server must handle this error, deleting an existing IPC structure and try to create it again. The client and the server can agree on a path name and project ID. The project ID is a character value between 0 and 225 and call the function fork to convert these two values into a key. This key is then used in step 2. The only service provided by fork is a way of generating a key from a path name and project ID. See the syntax here. Returns key if OK, key T -1 on error. The path argument must refer to an existing file. Only the lower 8 bits of ID are used when generating the key. The key created by fork is usually formed by taking parts of stdev and stino fields in these stat structure corresponding to the given path name and combining them with the project ID. If two path names refer to two different files, then ftalk usually returns two different keys for the two path names. However, because both inode numbers and keys are often stored in the long integers, there can be information loss creating a key. This means that two different path names, two different files can generate the same key if the same project ID is used. Now let us see permission structure. XSI IPC associates an IPC perm structure with each IPC structure. This structure defines the permissions and owner and includes at least the following members. See here. All the fields are initialized when the IPC structure is created. At a later time, we can modify the UID, GID and mode fields by calling message CT1 and SEM CT1 or SHMCTL. Sorry, this is message CTL, SEMCTL or SHMCTL. To change these values, the calling process must be either the creator of the IPC structure or the super user. Changing these fields is similar to calling change owner, change mode for a file. See the figure here. Now let us see configuration limits. All three forms of XSI IPC have built-in limits that we may encounter. Most of these limits can be changed by reconfiguring the kernel. We describe the limits when we describe each of the three forms of IPC. Advantages and disadvantages. A fundamental problem with XSI IPC is that the IPC structures are system-wide and do not have a reference count. For example, if we create a message queue, place some messages on the queue and then terminate the message queue and its contents are not deleted, they remain in the system until specially read or deleted by some process calling message RCV or message CTL by someone executing the IPCRM of one command or by the system being rebooted. Compare this with a pipe which is completely removed when the last process to reference it terminates. With a FIFO, although the name must stay in the file system until explicitly removed, any data left in the FIFO is removed when the last process to reference the FIFO terminates. Another problem with XSI IPC is that these IPC structures are not known by names in the file system. We can't access them and modify their properties with the functions. Almost a dozen new system calls were added to the kernel to support these IPC objects. We cannot see the IPC objects with an with an ls command. We can't remove them with the rm command, and we can't change their permissions with the change mode command. Instead, two new commands, ipcs of 1 and ipcrm of 1 were added. Since these forms of IPC don't use file descriptors, we can't use the multiplexed input-output functions with them. This makes it harder to use more than one of these IPC structures at a time, or to use any of these IPC structures with the file or device input-output. For example, we can't have a server wait for a message to be placed on one of two message queues without some form of busy wait loop. Now let us see message queues. A message queue is a linked list of messages stored within the kernel and the identified by a message queue identifier. We all call the message queue just a queue and its identifier as a queue ID. A new queue is created or an existing queue opened by message get. New messages are added to the end of the queue by message nd. Every message has a positive long integer type field, a non-negative length, and actual data bytes corresponding to the length, all of which are specified to message nd. When the message is added to the queue, messages are fetched from a queue by message RCV. We don't have to fetch the messages in a first in first out order. Instead, we can fetch messages based on their type field. Each queue has the following MSQID, this data structure associated with it. See here table. See this structure. This structure defines the current status of the queue. The first function normally called is message get to either open an existing queue or create a new queue. See the syntax here. Returns message queue ID if OK, one on error. When a new queue is created, the following members of the MSQID DS structure are initialized. The IPC perm structure is initialized. The mode member of this structure is set to the corresponding permission bits of flag. Message QNUM, message LSPID, message LRPID, message stime, and message rtime are all set to 0. Message C time is set to the current time. Message Q bytes is set to the system limit. On success, message get returns the non-negative queue ID. This value is then used with the other three message queue functions. The message CTL function performs various operations on a queue. See the syntax here. Returns 0 if OK, 1 on error. The command argument specifies the command to be performed on the queue specified by MSQID. See the table here. Data is placed onto a message queue by calling message end. See here syntax. Return 0 if OK, 1 on error. Each message is composed of a positive long integer type field, a non-negative length n bytes, and the actual data type corresponding to the length. Messages are always placed at the end of the queue. The pointer argument points to a long integer that contains the positive integer message type, and it is immediately followed by a message data. There is no message data if n bytes is 0. If the largest message we send is 512 bytes, we can define the following structure. See the structure here. The PTR argument is then a pointer to a my message structure. The message type can be used by the receiver to fetch messages in an order other than first in first out. Messages are retrieved from a queue by message RCV. See the here syntax. Returns size of the data portion of message if okay, 1 on error. The type argument lets us specify which message we want. See the table here. Now let us see semaphores. A semaphore is a counter used to provide access to a shared data object for multiple processes. To obtain a shared resource, a process needs to do the following. Test the semaphore that controls the resource. If the value of the semaphore is positive, the process can use the resource. In this case, the process decrements the semaphore value by 1, indicating that it has used 1 unit of the resource. Otherwise, if the value of the semaphore is 0, the process goes to sleep until the semaphore value is greater than 0. When the process wakes up, it returns to step 1. When a process is done with a shared resource that is controlled by a semaphore, the semaphore value is incremented by 1. If any other processes are asleep waiting for the semaphore, they are awakened. A common form of semaphore is called a binary semaphore. It controls a single resource and its value is initialized to 1. In general, however, a semaphore can be initialized to any positive value with the value indicating how many units of the shared resource are available for sharing. XSI semaphore are unfortunately more complicated than this. 3 features contribute to this unnecessary complication. First, a semaphore is not simply a single non-negative value. Instead, we have to define a semaphore as a set of 1 or more semaphore values. When we create a semaphore, we specify the number of values in the set. Second, the creation of the semaphore is independent of its initialization. This is a fatal flaw, since we cannot atomically create a new semaphore set and initialize all the values in the set. Third, since all forms of XSI IPC remain in existence even when no process is using them, we have to worry about a program that terminates without releasing the semaphores it has been allocated. The undo feature that we describe later is supposed to handle this. The kernel maintains a SemID DS structure for each semaphore set. Here, structure. Each semaphore is represented by an anonymous structure containing at least the following members. See here. The first function to call this semGet to obtain a semaphore ID is as follows. Returns semaphore ID if okay, 1 on error. When a new set is created, the following members of SemID DS structure are initialized. The IPC perm structure is initialized. The mode member of this structure is set to the corresponding permission bits of flag. SemO time is set to 0. SemC time is set to the current time. SemN sems is set to the n sems. The number of semaphores in the set is n sems. If a new set is being created, we must specify n sems. If we are referencing an existing set, we can specify n sems as 0. The semctl function is the call catch-all for various semaphore operations. See here. The fourth argument is optional depending on the command requested, and if present, if is of type C semun, comma a union of various command specific arguments. See here function and the table here. The command argument specifies one of the above 10 commands to be performed on the set specified by SemID. The function semapatomically performs an array of operations on a semaphore set. See here. Return 0 if okay, 1 on error. The semopare The sum of P array argument is a pointer to an array of semaphore operations represented by the sum buff structures. See here. The NOOPS argument specifies the number of operations in the array. The sum of element operations are values specifying the amount by which the semaphore value is to be changed. If sum of is an integer greater than 0, sum of adds the value to the corresponding semaphore element value and awakens all processes that are waiting for the element to increase. If sum up is 0 and the semaphore element value is not 0, sum up blocks the calling process and increments the count of the processes waiting for a 0 value of that element. If sum up is a negative number, sum up adds the sum up value to the corresponding semaphore element value provided that the result would not be negative. If the operation would make the element value negative, sum up blocks the process on the event that the semaphore element value increases. If the resulting value is 0, sum up wakes the process waiting for 0.